Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the Reconsider Simon podcast, and here's your host, me, Simon. This is podcast number 13, lucky 13 or unlucky for some people. And I did think about actually when I reached to podcast number 10, calling it podcast X, because X is everywhere these days when it's representing the number 10, which is weird in itself. I think there's a lot of occult references with the letter X being representative of 10. I think one day I should do a podcast on it. But yeah, today's episode is more of a journal style podcast. So it's to do with inspirational things that are occurring in my life, things that I've read, things that I've watched, things I've been thinking about. And yeah, so it's journal number 5, podcast 13, journal 5. But today's episode, I'm discussing briefly the vlogs that I've been doing. I've been trying to transition to doing more vlogging content on the YouTube channel, on the Rumble channel, and BitChute and Odyssey as well. It started with a journey that I did towards the end of April. And initially I went to Rendlesham. That was the inspiration for the whole journey, was to go there because I'd never been there before. And obviously it's the whole Rendlesham incident story involving US military interactions with UFOs and potential entities. And it just kind of springboarded other locations around the area. Orford Ness is one that I'm editing at the moment. Sutton Hoo is actually edited, viewable now. That was in about 3 weeks ago. So I'm looking at like a trilogy. There's a Rendlesham Forest video, Sutton Hoo, and then Orford Ness, and that kind of completes that whole Suffolk area in the United Kingdom. And if you don't come from this country, that's east side of the country, just above London. But I'm also going to be just talking about ideas to do with Göbeklitepe. And there's been a lot of stories I've noticed on the internet to do with WEF, the World Economic Forum, stopping excavations and getting in the way and suppressing knowledge. I had a cursory look into it. It's hard for me to find information to sort of back up some of the claims that were going on. But then I discovered this really quite interesting video produced by this individual, which really delved deep into how the WEF potentially connects into Göbeklitepe and how it's controlling the narrative of that particular sacred site. So, going to be talking about that. And on the more mundane matter, well, not mundane, but a pigeon died in our garden the other day, and it just got me thinking about, synchronicities, bird synchronicities, totems, animal medicine, some people describe it as. All of these animals have meaning when it comes into your life. There's always synchronicities, there's always a message and deeper meanings behind it. So I just wanted to talk about my experiences with birds and, being a point of synchronicities and some of the information I've gathered from my interaction with certain birds. So that's going to be coming up as well. And the very last point I'm going to be talking about is the fact that it was my birthday last week. Happy birthday to me. But yeah, just got me thinking about birthdays, where it comes from. I did a little bit of research to do with it as well. So going to be discussing that as well. But firstly, the videos, the vlogging videos. Initially done the Rendlesham Forest video. That's there. That's done. This is all from my trip that was back in April. And I visited Sutton Hoo, it's the sacred site kind of connected to that area of Rendlesham. And then Orford Ness is the one that's on my timeline at the moment, which I'm editing currently. So hopefully it'll be available at some point in the next few days after I finish this podcast as well. And it just details the entirety of my Suffolk adventures around there. It's a trilogy. I'm looking at it as a trilogy. And then after that particular Suffolk adventures, there's going to be a couple more videos to do with Glastonbury and Avebury. Honestly, the whole thing has taken a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. I thought I'd be able to kind of bash these out relatively quickly, but I guess I'm still finding my feet in terms of like how to edit vlogs and then making it interesting, and then also bringing in research as well and doing voiceovers. And it just takes a lot more time than I thought it was. The Sutton Hoo video was up around about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Very sacred site in Suffolk. Always find it interesting. It's all in a line. You get Sutton Hoo, the Rendlesham Forest, and then this military, sort of disused military base, Orford Ness. They're all vaguely in a line. But Sutton Hoo's kind of the spiritual centre of these Anglo-Saxon kings, and from my point of view, would probably be in a very sacred place even before them as well, which is why they wanted to be buried there to be close to these sacred energies in the landscape. That whole place now is under the care of the National Trust. But then at the time, the 1930s, they uncovered some very iconic treasures in terms of this big Anglo-Saxon boat, a king that was buried there, a queen as well, I think, his sword, various other bits of jewelry, and this very iconic helmet as well. If you saw it, you'd probably recognize it. And at that time, when there was a Netflix film that came out called The Dig, I remember seeing the film, but just never really made the connection between this particular film and that location for some strange reason. But it's based off a book of the same name as well. But yeah, the film's pretty good. I recommend giving it a viewing at some point. But what's fascinating about that whole film and the book that really popularized the whole story of the uncovering of this sacred site with all these sacred treasures that have been really, really important for Britain and its heritage and all the rest of it. Is the fact they completely ignored some of the deeper spiritual or mystical things that were going on during the process and the uncovering of this particular site, which is fascinating how they just completely ignored it. That whole landscape, including these burial mounds where all these sacred treasures were found, and it turned out to be this really important heritage site for the whole of the United Kingdom, was a complete surprise to everyone at the time, but is part of a larger estate. And this estate was originally owned by a lady called Edith Pretty and her husband. Her husband died, unfortunately, and she was left actually a single mother with a young son at the time. But she had these psychic visions, these prophetic dreams. This is how she had the inspiration to try and find an archaeologist, to try and do a dig, to sort of search in these burial mounds. It felt like the dead and spiritualism was actually calling out to her to kind of perform this archaeological dig to uncover these treasures for the country as a whole. Edith Pretty was heavily involved with spiritualism and also would try and connect with her dead husband as well to get advice. And, the fact that the story, the uncovering of Sutton Hoo and the treasures, and they completely ignore all this psychic information, all this spiritualist information. Even one of the main excavators, a guy called Basil Brown, was taking psychic advice at various points in the dig as well. So the whole thing really was driven by this psychic information. The fact that, these films or the books that are written about this whole excavation completely ignore. They don't ignore, but they push it to the side. It's really, really a tiny point in the overall story that they talk about. When actually it's really quite a big main focus of the whole story itself. So that's Sutton Hoo. I recommend you give it a watch if you've got a spare half hour. And then the next video that's coming up is Orford Ness. This is going to be the final episode in the trilogy involving Rendlesham Forest. And at the time, I knew nothing about this site at all. It was only before I went to the area, I was having a look on Google Maps, and I just came across this strange little island just on the east coast of Suffolk. And they're all in a line, these sites. You have like Sutton Hoo and then Rendlesham Forest, and then you go out to the coast and you hit Orford Ness. And I just started to look at some of the pictures that were kind of related to this map location. I just started to see all this strange, very dystopian looking military architecture. And I was like, ooh, that's fascinating. But as soon as you arrived in that whole area, you just realised that whole sort of area of England, Suffolk, East Anglia, is just littered with military bases. Some of them are still operational. A lot of them are defunct and no longer operating anymore. But I just started to look at the Rendlesham Forest and all these military activity as part of that whole story. So it's really important to bring these places in. And just, going back to some of the details of the incident itself, it all happened back in 1980 in December, slightly after Christmas, and involved, US military. This is the height of the Cold War. So hostilities with Russia were kind of red hot at the time. And the US military was sort of bedded in military bases such as Woodbridge and Bentwaters. And actually still to this day, there's still quite a heavy US military presence in that area. Not at those particular military bases, sort of elsewhere, but they still have a foothold there. So it's late at night and this US military personnel start to see strange lights in the forests and the stories of military interacting with UFOs and then potentially entities. And it wasn't one night as well. It happened over multiple nights. Some people say even 4 nights this occurred. But I wanted to look at, the whole area holistically. So again, it was just about bringing all these military facilities into view and you start to research a lot of these military facilities. A lot of them are involved in military testing, and a lot of the time to do with frequency, particularly Orford Ness. And there's loads of legendary stories to do with Tesla style technology and death rays. So there's a lot of strange testing going on. So again, you start to think about how much of this is involved in the Rendlesham incident. And when you have this large military presence in a particular place, it always tends to be quite sacred areas, places where there's a lot of energy. It happens in America, happens in other countries, happens in the UK in terms of Wiltshire. You've got Avebury and Stonehenge. There's a lot of military activity around there as well. And it's the same, in my humble opinion, with Suffolk, because you have the Sutton Hoo. And when I actually arrived in the area, I was staying in a relatively cheap hotel in the centre of Ipswich. It's probably about half an hour, 45 minutes away from Rendlesham Forest itself. I had a very powerful, energetic experience, the first night there. So for me, I felt the energy. There's something palpable about that place. And it was incredibly surprising, particularly the fact I was in a inner city location. So it wasn't like I was surrounded by nature and I had this quite deep, energetic experience. So from my point of view, definitely the veil between realities is very thin in that area. So there's that big question, are the military harnessing those energies in some way? So even before I arrived at Rendlesham, it was looking at places, like Orford Ness, and later when I arrived, I sort of came across this place called Myrtlesham Heath. I drove past it. I was like, oh, that looks weird. Just intuitively, I just thought at the time, there's something going on. These places are all connected to the Rendlesham Forest incident. This needs to be folded into the story. But I didn't know how. And it was only later, having done some research, when I was editing this vlog to do with Orford Ness, that I start to realize there is actually information to kind of back up my intuitive understanding. So structurally, Orford Ness, it just have this very wild, dystopian, Cold War looking architecture. And the whole place itself has been operational since the 1913s. So it was very active during World War I, World War II, also the Cold War as well. And so it's been operating for a long time now. It's disused. It's not operating anymore. It's under the care, again, of the National Trust. But wildly, you have institutions like the BBC. I found an article describing it as Britain's Area 51, which is weird, because obviously Area 51 is to do with like suppressed technology and potential UFOs. So I find it fascinating that the BBC, very big mainstream news place, is making that link between Orford Ness and strange technology. Now, when you visit there, you see all the mainstream information to do with what they want you to know in terms of some of the research that was done at this facility. And they talk about things like radar development, bomb development, just general aeronautics, nuclear war technology. So all of that information is in the open, but is there something more to the story? Is there technologies that are deeper than this? Particularly frequency, you have frequency and electricity, and this springboards into so many different other scientific areas. You can have frequency to heal the human body. You can have frequency to influence them, to maybe mind control them. You can even potentially use frequency to open portals. So could it then tie into interdimensional travel? Who knows? But it's all rather fortuitous, because as I, have been researching for Orford Ness particularly, I came across an individual called Professor Simon Holland, and he has a whole channel on YouTube, and he's done so much research to do with Orford Ness, also the Rendlesham Forest event, and then he's been working quite closely with John Burroughs, who's been one of the main experiences of the Rendlesham event. He was one of the military personnel. He's now retired as an older man. But yeah, he had his own experiences at Rendlesham Forest. So him and Simon Holland at the moment are working quite closely to try and unravel this puzzle of the Rendlesham event. But I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. But like I said, he's got many videos to do with Rendlesham, particularly to do with death ray research, which then links into Tesla, this style of death ray technology. Potentially there's legendary stories that Orford Ness were messing around with this technology. So in this video, I'm going to look into that. But surprisingly, there's this whole facility on the island. It's massive. When I went there, I wasn't allowed to gain access to it. There's only certain areas you can kind of walk to on the island when you're there. And this facility is called Cobra Mist. All sounds very ominous. But from the mainstream point of view in the news, they described this as being over the horizon radar that was being developed during the Cold War. So it was against hostilities with Russia. And it closed down very, very quickly shortly after becoming operational, which is very, very strange. But what Simon has found out, that it wasn't, over the horizon radar, it's potentially an EMP weapon. So again, this ties into Tesla's death ray research, that something strange was going on. So again, does then this all tie into this new information? Does this tie into the Rendlesham Forest? So you have two potential avenues here of thought. Some of these technologies that are being experimented on, did this create the Rendlesham Forest event in some way? Did you open a portal? Are these just kind of plasma energy things that are flying around that the military created that are tricking people to think they're seeing UFOs? There's so many different aspects to potentially what is going on. Or is it an unintended consequence? When you're messing around with these high energy weaponry, you're creating rips in space time. Are you inadvertently then allowing other entities to come into this reality? So overall, this is what the next video is going to be about, Orford Ness, and it's the direction that my research and my understanding of Rendlesham Forest, where it's kind of going, that it, Orford Ness does in some way tie into the whole story. And then once I've done the Orford Ness video that's uploaded, I'm going to then look onto the Glastonbury and Avebury and some of my experiences there as well. But they're not really connected to Rendlesham Forest, obviously, but it was all part of that same trip. Now we can move on to the bird synchronicities. This all comes off the back of a conversation I had a few weeks ago. And it's a running theme. I always bring up this conversation to see what people's response is. But I always say how weird it is. You have so many birds in the sky, and it's so very, very rare to actually see a dead bird. Judging the amount of birds you see as you walk around, even within a city, you have a lot of birds flying around. I think we're quite lucky in the United Kingdom that generally a lot of the cities, even London, tend to have a lot of trees, a lot of parks. So there are a lot of birds flying around. And previously I lived in Brighton, so that's right on the coast. And so you had a lot of seagulls around there as well. So yeah, but I just think it's strange how it's very, very rare that you see a dead bird. Why is that? And this is a topic I've actually tackled in the very early days of my YouTube channel. I did a whole video to do with bird synchronicities, but I thought I'd talk about on the podcast as well briefly. But it was very sort of early days of the YouTube channel. I'm more sort of moving towards podcasting and potential vlogging. So I've moved away from that format when I was talking directly to camera to do with concepts. But when you're talking about bird synchronicities, obviously that all links to the entirety of the animal kingdom. Some people call them animal totems or, animal medicine. There's so many cultures around the world that have reverence for synchronicities with animals. With the United Kingdom, you have sort of pagan beliefs or Celtish beliefs or Norse mythology, sort of Scandinavian countries or Native American. They're probably in all indigenous cultures. There's an element of gathering synchronicities and information and psychic visions, through animals. The way our reality is laid out, when we have access to sort of TV programs and to films and to artwork, the internet, we're always aware of the time, there's books, there's all these things that can give you synchronicities, it can give you inspiration, it can be nudging you in a certain direction. But for a lot of people, it can be, digital based, people looking at their phone, they're seeing particular times, they're seeing particular numbers, repeating numbers. And the same way they're looking at their computer, or if you, maybe you watch a YouTube video, you see the viewing counter in a particular video and you're getting synchronistic sort of numbers from that as well. So we're kind of surrounded by it all the time. You can even get repeating numbers on car number plates. And there's so many physical elements to our reality where you can see numbers. There's a very funny one I had the other day when I saw these two bins, and they related to a particular building, and both of the bins had 44 painted on it. So I had two double four synchronicities with these bins. Obviously, if you're in the United States or somewhere else in the world, you might refer to them as trash cans. But yeah, bin synchronicity was a really new one for me. But yeah, messages and inspiration and nudges from the universe can come from, music lyrics, people you meet, conversations you have, stories you tell each other. Again, I'll reiterate there are so many avenues, the ways of you getting synchronistic messages because we're just surrounded by culture, particularly if you live in like towns or cities, but back in the olden days, before we had all this whiz bang technology, what did you do? You would get your spiritual messages from nature, from animals. Generally, if an animal comes into my life and I perceive it as being synchronistic, maybe there's a message behind it. There's a particular book that I have called Animal Speak, written by Ted Andrews. I think it's quite a famous one. And it very much writes from a Native American perspective, all the various animals. So, not necessarily in the United Kingdom does it have all the animals there, but it has a good guide anyway. But a lot of the times as well, I just do a general internet search. There's so many blogs and websites that have kind of written various spiritual messages to do with particular animals. So I had treated it as a point of divination, like a divination task. So depending on what website I appear on or what blog I appear on, that's the message that is potentially linked to the animal that I saw. But then also you can just generally feel into it as well. Sometimes that works for me, sometimes it doesn't. But maybe you just have an hit of inspiration. It kind of gives you a message of why you're seeing that animal. So that message might come from within yourself as well, as opposed to from an exterior source. So when I previously lived in Brighton, which is on the south coast, it being a seaside town, you have seagulls, and the seagulls there are crazy. They're literally the size of a large cat. They're massive, and their diet is considerably bad. I mean, you'd always expect maybe seagulls to eat, fish from the sea, but the seagulls there, because it's a holiday destination, they're eating burgers, they're eating chips, they're eating crisps that are found on the floor. They very, very bolshy, and they can just literally grab chips out of a person's hand if you're walking down the seafront with chips, open. They'll just swoop in there and they'll just take the whole lot. They don't care. When you put your rubbish out to be collected as well, like household rubbish, birds will just get in there, they'll rip open the bin bags and they'll just get stuck in. Again, they'll just eat anything in the rubbish. So their diet is really, really, really weird. But the seagulls, in Brighton are such an emblem of the city. Even the football club that are doing quite well these days, that's their emblem. They're called the Brighton Seagulls. And I remember a really quite special synchronicity that I had with seagulls when I was living in Brighton at the time. This new co-work place had opened just on the seafront. It was a kind of new community of people. And it was a brand spanking new office. And it was for freelancers and for self-employed people. Nice swanky place to go along to. And it was a great place to be, like really nice environment. The people there were really lovely. And it was right in the centre of town as well. So it's to really enjoy working from there. But there was a really nice moment when we were all kind of sat on the top floor and I was kind of working. And this seagull, like every day, the first week I was there, would, fly over onto the windowsill and just peck on the window. And it just made people laugh. And it was only slightly later that I started to really kind of understand the significance of that because, seagulls are very, very sociable animals. They're very loud. They're always like chatting and talking to each other. And that was one of the bad things sometimes when you lived in the centre of Brighton was that you would get woken up by the squawks, these like cries of seagulls at like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Like after a while, you do sort of get used to it, but they are so loud and so shrill because they're really, really sociable animals. Anyway, I started to then relate this kind of story of this seagull then, going onto the window and pecking on the windows because it was the forming of this new community, this new group of people. And this seagull was just like marking that occasion. So really, really beautiful memory for me. So this whole concept of birds being strange to me goes back a few years. And at the time I was sat on the beach with some friends. And again, I brought up this thing that it's weird how there's all these birds, especially in Brighton, you just never see dead birds. And I even start to convince them, and they're very, very straight-laced, not spiritual at all, not conspiratorial at all. But even they started to be convinced that it was strange that you never see a dead bird. So what tends to happen when you voice something like that, off into the universe, that you get feedback, you get a result, and something happened to me. And then shortly after that, probably about 2 or 3 weeks after me claiming this thing on the beach, you never see dead birds, I just started to see dead birds and they just started appearing into my life. And the very, very first one that I came across, I was walking through this park called Preston Park, really big, beautiful park, sort of towards the end of Brighton. And I just came across this bird and it was actually at the point of death. And it was a little bit uncomfortable to watch because he was like writhing around in pain. And I didn't know what to do. I was sort of stood there and I thought, maybe I can find a big stone and sort of put it out of its misery. I don't have this bushcraft skills where I can literally take a bird and then just wring its neck and break its neck cleanly. I didn't know what to do. So I couldn't find a big stone. That was my only option in terms of trying to put it out of its misery. So in the end, I just sort of like, I just had to leave it. But yeah, it was weird. It was just how it was just writhing around in pain and hopefully just died shortly afterwards. And then literally probably a week or two after that experience, then I came across another dead bird, but this time this bird had died, but only recently, so that it had obviously further in the whole death process. And then another following week happened, a week or two. Then I saw another dead bird, but this time in a more advanced state of decay. This then happened a couple of more times, and each week the bird would be in a sort of more decayed state. And towards the end, it was like literally, I remember I think it was just wings and had been completely flattened on the pavement on the road by a car, I think. So yeah, there was hardly anything of the bird left, but it was just this very sequential period of events which just saw this death process of a bird. And the way that I took it, it was as a real death of self happening for me at the time, like very powerful spiritual experience. And it was just the birds were essentially like, it's a milestone for that. And also, I just come out of this very short but quite intense romance. And at the time, I got it to my head that this girl was my twin flame. And because it was such high levels of intensity, of energy and instability, I felt there was just this really powerful experience. It was a powerful experience in many ways. But I think it was that first time towards the end when I saw that last heavily decayed bird that I sort of got out that mindset of just this intensity of this romantic fling. So yeah, it was just so many things happening at once. It was a real death of self and a complete personal transformation as well. That's the message I took from it. So this is really how I got into birds as being a point of synchronicity, a point of feedback. Whereas before I was very much into sort of numbers and just general other synchronicities, but nature hadn't really factored into it for me. But that whole experience with the birds, and it was so pronounced, I remember very vividly sort of sat on that beach saying those words about it's strange you don't see these dead birds. And then literally 2 weeks later, the universe is going, aha, this is your first dead bird. And then, next week, another dead bird. But it was very obvious they're in a sort of slightly different period of death or decay, and it just followed my life at that particular point where I was just really transitioning from this, powerful kind of romance, short romance, but then just general like personal transformation at the time as well. Lots of other things going on in my life, and it just really marked that occasion. So personally, to me, birds have been this really powerful synchronicity. I mean, all animals have been, but for some reason, I've had particularly quite powerful experiences with birds. But putting a slight comedic slant on things, there's a very funny parody that I became aware of a while ago, and it's this thing called Birds Aren't Real. And it was started by Peter McIndoe, I think his name is, back in 2017. And at the time, he's in his early 20s. And this whole thing is a real kind of a meme, just a trolling exercise. He's kind of slightly taking the piss out of conspiracy theorists. He's sort of playing this character. But he created this character and he started to go around claiming that birds don't really exist and that majority of the real ones were actually killed by the US government. And the ones that they see in the environment now, they're all robotic drones, basically, with this like mass scale surveillance. So he garnered quite a cult following and he was, started to go viral on various social media networks, various news platforms started to carry his story, like mainstream news platforms. The majority of people knew he was trolling. And then obviously the mainstream really picked up on it because they saw that he was trolling. They liked to sort of create that thing. A conspiracy is only being thought of by crazy people. So it just really kind of lent into that whole narrative. But if you read into his background, he comes from what they would call, I'm not really into that whole idea of left-right paradigm, but he was born into, right-wing Christian conservative background. And I think his parents are quite fire and brimstone with their messages with Christianity. So I think this whole thing was a real rebellious act against all that, against all those fire and brimstone messaging. I mean, I'm a big fat conspiracy theorist, and obviously the way that the mainstream frame this, they're obviously leaning into it because they're sort of so, look, all conspiracy theorists are stupid, but I can laugh at myself as well. And hilariously, part of this podcast is about birds, how they're strange, how they don't feel real, and maybe they're part of this sort of strange matrix-like reality that we have. I don't know. It's just they're very, very interesting animals. But what is quite fantastic about this whole, like, I guess, this whole movement that he created was just the amount of effort he went into. And he just sort of constantly like maintained his character. And I started to sort of partially watch. He did a whole TED talk and he was in character, very seriously talking about this conspiracy and how it was really, really serious. But it's just the level of craftsmanship that he's sort of gone into creating this whole mythology is quite amazing. He's written like loads of fake documentation and evidence. There's various books written about it, really well designed books. And you can go on their website. Again, it's quite nicely designed and all the merchandise looks really high quality. So he's created this whole environment, this whole mythology around it, this whole lore around it. It's just really amazing to look at. In fact, I can give you, through the wonders of technology, a taste of the audio from one of his videos sort of discussing the whole scenario of this conspiracy. I'll play it for you now.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
We all remember where we were when that happened. But what if I told you that something far greater was at play in this very moment? A saga of government corruption so entrenched in our society that to expose it would make Watergate a mere footnote in the pages of history.
For the last few years, my team and I have been investigating the biggest crime ever perpetrated on the American people.
Since the Eisenhower administration, the U.S. government has been committing genocide on the entire bird population and replacing these birds with sophisticated robot replicas, equipped with 5-megapixel cameras and a sophisticated tracking system that can follow your every movement. I know this is horrifying, but please remember, stay calm. It is estimated that by 2001, 90% of the birds that we see in the sky will actually be surveillance robots. We must act now to prevent this from going any further. Join us, and together we can make 1987 the year that we take back our freedom.
So there you go. Birds aren't real. Check it out for yourself. On the last podcast, I was discussing the Matrix film, the very, very first one, about the importance of it to culture. Obviously, they re-released the film in cinemas, 25 years. Amazing film still, but it just all plays into that idea of our reality. There's so much talk these days to do about our reality and people, talking about computer simulations and stuff. And it just really ties into the thing about how, for me anyway, my humble opinion, that birds are really, really strange, beautiful animals. And they are fantastic in the way they interact with the environment from a, natural point of view, where they're very much connected potentially with the ionosphere. And apparently, depending whether it's day or night, the ionosphere moves up and down because it cools and it heats up. And so this kind of movement in the ionosphere, birds apparently sense. And so they know when to wake up in the morning. And this then initiates their mooring chorus. And because of this frequency of this mooring chorus from all these birds, it aids the opening of flowers and leaves. The frequency, apparently, even scientifically, this has sort of been proven that they do resonate with this noise, this level of frequency coming from the birds, and it initiates them to open up in the morning, the flowers and the leaves. So there's a real intrinsic sort of thread of connection between these natural things. It's very poetic and beautiful how, the birds are really very much intrinsically interacting with nature on this very profound level. But even for us humans as well, that very sound of hearing a bird tweet is an incredible natural de-stressor. And so if you unfortunately live in an environment where you're not hearing birds in the morning or throughout the day, that your stress levels can be quite high because of it. So just naturally hearing bird song is a great de-stressor and really reduces like tension within the body. Jumping deeper into the birds aren't real, how they're strange creatures. This was reported quite widely in various tabloids across the world, in fact, and involves a former military defense individual. He's now retired from that position, but he used to head up a particular UFO desk at the MOD. Some people say that was a bit of a front, but essentially this particular desk would be sent various UFO sightings that occurred across the United Kingdom, and it was his job to catalogue it and to investigate it and give an opinion on it. And has now a very successful career. I think he lives in America, and he's very much on the tour circuit. I've been to various conferences. I think I've been to a couple, and he's actually been one of the speakers there. He's always a very nice, amiable guy. He's very pleasurable to listen to. But it comes from a very official line. He talks very officially about UFOs. There's no real spirituality to like what he speaks about. And then don't forget, obviously, he's assigned the British Official Secrets Act as well. So there's probably various things he's not unable to talk about as well because of his oath. I've been rabbiting on. I realise I haven't mentioned this guy's name, Nick Pope, formerly of the military defence in the United Kingdom. And he previously headed up the UFO research desk at the MOD itself. His profile and visibility has exploded due to the fact that he's on Ancient Aliens, a really popular TV show, which I've never really seen before, but I'm aware it's really, really big. And I can see, because I follow him on Facebook, he seems to go on a tour with Ancient Aliens and goes to various cities in the United States. And so he's got quite a big profile now. So whenever there's a UFO story in the mainstream news, whether it be in the UK or the US, he tends to be called upon to sort of speak on television. And they always perceive him to have gravitas because he had that official job as part of the military defense in the United Kingdom. So when I came across this article, it's quite surprising because actually it's very, very straight-laced, very, very official. But there was a story that came out in the Daily Mirror in the United Kingdom, but it was in other sort of news articles as well across the world. But this particular article was written in April 2022. Nick was quoted as saying, "If aliens want to hack into and control a living organism or construct a drone as a perfect mimic, it would be best to choose something ordinary and ubiquitous, like a seagull or a housefly. Something you wouldn't normally pay much attention to, perhaps, but all the time it would be spying on us, recording everything and sending information about us back to the alien homeworld. So next time you move to swat that fly, watch out, your actions might inadvertently start an interstellar war." He added, "If aliens are secretly monitoring Earth, they'll be doing up close and personal, not with distant telescopes, but in a way that would enable them to get crystal clear images and recordings right under our noses. Any civilization capable of getting here from other star systems undoubtedly has technology that would seem like magic to us, and one possibility is that they might be able to implant a living creature with a tiny camera and recording devices and then control its thoughts to position it anywhere of interest. A related alternative would be to construct drones that are indistinguishable from an animal, a bird, or an insect. If that sounds like science fiction, it isn't." When I read that article, I thought that was particularly open-minded of Nick Pope, and I was really surprised that that thought came from him. But, he's right. As a thought experiment, he's not wrong. It's definitely a possibility. And, this ties into the whole scenario of birds, and in particular, owls have this strange connection with UFOs and high strangeness and folklore. Owls have a lot of symbolism behind it, very much in the occult realms as well. If you stretch your belief system to be as far as the fact that potentially maybe politics is an illusion and there's probably another layer of governance that kind of works above transnationally and just completely ignores borders, that is controlling this sort of theatre of politics, which I do. And then actually they kind of work in the shadows and they're using occult symbolism to sort of signify their dominance over humanity. And so there are these little tidbits of symbolism to indicate that. So apparently if you zoom into an American money, paper money, you'll see a very, very tiny owl, that, sort of peeping back at the viewer. And it's this whole idea that, they're always watching the eye, the owls are always watching. And then also weirdly, if you zoom out from high above the White House and then you look at the White House from a bird's eye view, so you're sort of seeing the White House in the, fitting in within the landscape, you do see this very distinct shape of an owl's head. It's really, really bizarre. So it's very much over plain sight, symbolism of the owl watching humanity, stating that they're in control in a way. A number of months back, I started to rewatch Twin Peaks. When it first came out, I was only quite young. I think it originally came out on BBC Two in the United Kingdom. And I probably saw a few of them, but didn't quite understand some of the deeper concepts. And then rewatching it, recently I realized, how surreal and how much, high strangeness knowledge is kind of it threaded throughout the entire series. And was one particular aspect of Twin Peaks in terms of the conversation to do with birds. They utilize a lot to do with owl symbolism, features incredibly heavily. And owls in Twin Peaks very much represent this supernatural force throughout the series. And then there's a situation where there's a giant talking to the agent Cooper, and he says to him, "The owls are not what they seem." So very prophetic message, which kind of rings true throughout the entire of Twin Peaks. And owls generally throughout the series always appear in moments of really high tension and stress. And do actually, if you've seen it, there's a kind of thing called the Black Lodge, and the owl sort of like represents this strange etheric Black Lodge, and it's very much like an observer of the human realm, and very much represents this Black Lodge, this very negative dimensional force that you only really start to understand towards the end of the series itself. I've only really seen the first two series. I know back in 2017 they created another one, and so perhaps at some point I should dip into that. But it's such a classic series, pretty surreal, but I just love the aesthetics of it. It's vaguely aesthetically like a soap opera. It has this very, very surreal cinematic element to it as well. Quite groundbreaking for the time, considering, you get these very movie adjacent sort of TV series now, which are, quite commonplace everywhere due to streaming platforms. But yeah, that David Lynch really broke a lot of barriers in terms of like what TV series could be, and the fact it has so much symbolism, so much truth to do with potentially how our reality is organized. It's definitely a must see. But David Lynch's treatment of owls and their importance and the symbolism is, it reflects what happens in reality. There's a huge connection between UFOs and people's abduction experiences and people seeing owls sort of simultaneously or leading up to a particular event. There's an individual who wrote a book called The Messages by Mike Cleland, I think his name is. But he basically collected a whole range of people's paranormal experiences, which actually involved owls. So this is quite a regular, well-known, situation. There are countless stories of people having UFO or abduction experiences, but strangely, after the experience, they're left with this very, potent owl imagery, like remembrance within their memory, and they, tend to have missing time as well. So they vaguely recollect that they've been somewhere and they've missed time, but all they have is strange imagery to do with owls, like it's acting like a screen memory to sort of hide their actual true experience they had. And some of the owls that people are encountering in these, paranormal experiences, be they some interdimensional, interaction or maybe UFO experience, then the owls that they're interacting with aren't, just normal size. Some of them, interacting with owls are actually quite significantly large. There's one story involving a contactee, and he had a UFO experience while driving, and then shortly afterwards, then pulled over in his car, shocked about what had happened. And then as he got out of the car, he saw this 4-foot owl just standing there with this incredibly large wingspan, which was larger than the entire car itself. And obviously, that sort of owl just does not exist in nature. So, very weird connection between the UFO experience and this kind of 4-foot owl. And again, this is replicated across other experiences, not just this one individual. It's happened repetitively for different people. There was an article specifically that was written concerning his whole experience involving the writer of The Messages, and it's a Vice article, vice.com, and the title is "For UFO Hunters, the Owls Really Aren't What They Seem," and it's dated May 2021, so relatively recent. But this is an extract from that particular article, and it goes like this. Among the many anecdotes, Cleland tells me some of the most common experiences surround missing time. Contactees stop to admire an owl, and when they're on their way again, they realise hours have passed. A theory is these owl appearances could be screen memories, physically implanted visions where owls are merely disguised stand-ins, with hypnotic regression therapy later revealing something much weirder. In fact, they're so common that according to Cleland, when he brought up the owl phenomenon to the late veteran alien abduction researcher Bud Hopkins, he would roll his eyes and say that the stories are everywhere. So there you go, that's owls, very mystical creatures. I was trying to remember if I've ever really seen an owl in the wild. I've seen owls obviously in the zoo or in captivity, maybe in a sanctuary. But I always remember when I used to live in Twickenham, just outside of London, I used to run along the River Thames quite frequently. I could always hear the owls in the evening when I was running, because obviously owls tend to call out at night time. And but I would never see them at all. Obviously, they're pretty well camouflaged due to their feathers, but it's a very haunting sound when they do their call at night time. But yeah, very strange creatures. But now moving on from, birds and how birds aren't real and the strangeness and the paranormal of birds, be looking at Göbekli Tepe, I think that's how you say it. But yes, this is the story that's been making the rounds, and obviously Göbekli Tepe is quite important, relatively recent site that's been uncovered, sacred site based in Turkey. And there's been a lot of stories I've noticed on the internet saying how the WEF, the World Economic Forum, is somehow in control of it and has ceased all excavation of the place itself and is suppressing, the understanding of this sacred place. And I remember doing a little bit of research trying to confirm this story, because you can kind of read stuff on Twitter sometimes, and sometimes people are either, exaggerating the story or, also they can lie as well, like any other mainstream news source. So I was quite keen to sort of confirm whether this is true or not. So I started to do a bit of research and found it actually quite difficult to confirm that. But then I just stumbled across this video from this gentleman who did a really, really good deep dive into the whole situation and really kind of shows some of the deep connections and how potentially the WEF is sort of controlling Göbekli Tepe. Overall, I've never really known a huge amount about this site. I've moved from the land of conspiracy and extraterrestrials and all that jazz. And the whole sacred sites and earth energies for me is still relatively young topic, even though, majority of this podcast tends to be on those subjects. But I'm learning as I go, essentially, as I'm sort of moving into more land-based energies and the understanding and things to do with suppressed technologies and how spirituality kind of fits with all these aspects. But that entire site was spoken pretty regularly at start again. This whole topic was spoken about pretty heavily during Megalithomania in Glastonbury of May of this year, which I attended with various speakers there, and they all had their own theories and their own research about what was going on at that particular site. Some really, really interesting stuff. But it was really the first time or the first opportunity I've had to sort of have a deeper understanding about potentially what that site was used for, what it was constructed, and also some of the symbology that's going on with the carvings in the stone as well. But some just general info about the site itself. It's located in southeast Turkey and is now perceived, pretty widely as the world's oldest known temple. And according to the mainstream timeline of dates, sometimes this can vary depending who you talk to, I guess. But if you do a general search on the internet, you're going to be finding people placing it probably at 9,600 BC. So roughly about 12,000 years ago. So in that case, again, on the mainstream timeline, it predates things like Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid. So really important sacred site, potentially older than all of these potential areas around the world like Stonehenge. So obviously makes it even more important. The site was originally discovered and uncovered by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt in 1990. So again, relatively recently. And it has these really huge, iconic T-shaped stone pillars placed in this circular formation. Now, the pillars themselves have these really amazing carvings on there of various characters, aspects of nature in terms of different animals, and other aspects of symbolism. So it has a lot of archaeologists really scratching their heads and researchers getting quite excited by some of the messages that may be able to be garnered from this particular site. The whole discovery has really challenged the mainstream timelines in terms of the ancient world and ancient civilizations and how sophisticated, people were. It's a general trend that's occurring at the moment where, civilization, the ancient world and the sophistication is getting older and older and older as more and more knowledge is uncovered. And the reason it's been protected for so many thousands of years is that it was buried under tons and tons of rubble. And some are theorizing actually this burial was done on purpose to protect the site, either from manipulation from particular civilizations or, just, as a time capsule for future generations. So they'd have more of an understanding of potentially their own origins. And so, some people think that it was buried on purpose just to protect this particular site. But I think majority of the mainstream academia tends to perceive actually the burial just occurred due to, various seismic events and earth changes. And that was the reason why the whole site was covered. Because apparently what tends to happen when you have a sophisticated site like Göbekli Tepe, that you would have evidence of a civilization growing around it in terms of people, farming, keeping animals, maybe having habitations where they live. And generally they develop in a type of sophistication as, the years go by. But this site is very, very different because it just came out of nowhere. It's like, bang, suddenly there you have these sophisticated craftspeople creating this amazing structure. As I mentioned, various aspects of the stone T-shaped pillars, they have these various animal carvings, depictions, and a lot of borrowed iconography that links to star constellations as well. But there's a real huge similarity between various Sumerian carvings as well. You have these like strange handbags, which are also featuring on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe. So that's weird. You've got these completely different civilizations and completely different areas with the same iconography. What's amazing and really brings into the, how large the scale of the site itself is that at the moment, only 5% of the site has been uncovered. And this is where the controversy begins, because obviously you've still got 95% sat there. So, what else is being hidden there? And so this then sort of ties into the WEF, stopping excavations and the conspiracies surrounding that. And you say, why would you want to keep it buried? Like, why wouldn't you want to uncover more of it, understand it, and obviously convey some of the information you find out to the rest of the population of the world? Again, what are they hiding? This starts to follow a general trend, with, people being prevented from accessing sacred sites. In the example of United Kingdom, you have Stonehenge, where people are restricted from really directly getting close to the stones themselves. So you buy a ticket and you can only really walk around it. To get access to the stones, you have to go there for a solstice or go on a paid tour. And, you could look at it as a practical reason. You have so many people going there. You can't have everyone go there because they could damage the site. I mean, that is a fair assumption. But also is something deeper going on. Are you being prevented from accessing the energies of that particular site and being able to interface with the stones themselves? And it's a bit of a large jump, but you can start to look at potentially global conflicts. And, during the Syrian conflict, and you had ISIS, this supposed terrorist force that was going around Syria and places of Iraq and demolishing sacred sites. And, there's a lot of, from my point of view, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that some of these terrorist organizations do have a certain foothold within Western intelligence agencies. They're potentially like a proxy army. So again, you got to start to theorize of whether these ISIS terrorist groups were actually carrying out the bidding again of some kind of like Western global force that wants to prevent humanity accessing the ancient civilization past and the knowledge that they have. Because as a people, if you don't have access to your heritage and understanding the ancient world and some of the knowledge that they had, then it makes you a controllable entity because you just don't have any real context about who you are and where you've come from. So again, that sort of ties into, the reason why they're doing this, why they're preventing people from potentially accessing these sacred sites. And that's just the information, the story, the narrative of these places. I mean, also these sacred sites, they have energy. They're placed in a particular place for a reason, for the energy. So again, if people can't access that energy, what does that mean for the wider of humanity? Going back to megalithomania and some of the speakers there, some of them were saying that how, they're trying to paint Göbeklitepe as not being as impressive as it is, and starting to try and perceive it as being more of a residence, more of a community space, and not really being a place of worship or, a special sacred place at all. So they're trying to make it quite mundane, to make it seem less interesting and seem boring in a way, just to kind of put people off the idea of visiting potentially. But going back to the idea of the WEF and, how much are they involved in this particular archaeological place? And, I was doing cursory research on Twitter, trying to find various information. It was only really until I sort of jumped onto YouTube. And again, it's quite hard sometimes to search on YouTube due to censorship controls these days, but sometimes there are ways of getting around it. But I stumbled across a video from a channel called Bright Insight, which I'd never heard of before, but it seems quite a successful channel because it's got a few million subscribers to it. But it had a particular video to do with Göbekli Tepe on this particular topic, about the WEF or how they're controlling it and sort of suppressing information. Of course, I'll add the video link to the description notes of this podcast. But this video was released early June of this year, and it did a really good job of research and exposing this particular connection. And like most things in the world to do with these, shadowy figures and shadowy entities, this is just very subtle control. It's not overt in your face, but definitely the kind of connections are there if you kind of research deeper into it. But in terms of Göbekli Tepe, that it's under the care and tender of an organization called the Dogus Group, which is a humongous Turkish conglomerate. It's essentially a business, and it started apparently as a construction company in 1951. And the chairman of this particular company is called Ferit Shanek. I hope I said his name correctly. So it's this particular organization that actually has close links to the WEF and works very, very closely with it. So there's an aspect to this Dogus group that is basically involved in cultural heritage and sustainable development, and again is parented with the WEF to promote Göbekli Tepe as this cultural destination. Actually, they've facilitated a 20-year partnership with this organization. So this is how long they intend to, inform Göbekli Tepe. So it's this Turkish conglomerate Dogus Group with, in partnership with the WEF that has essentially stopped all excavation at the site. And this has been the same since 2008. And apparently there is little excavating going on at existing sites, but nothing new. And there's still like 95% of this whole area still needs to be uncovered, but they've just completely stopped. And just to pour salt into the wound as well, they've also started to build roads and various pathways to the site, which is actually affecting and damaging the sacred site underneath. And they've built an elevated walkway that kind of wraps around the site, obscuring particular areas so you can't see clearly some of the aspects of the structure itself. And the official reason why they're leaving 95% of the site covered is that they perceive they're protecting it for future generations. But that doesn't make any sense. Why not uncover it and then try and protect it? I mean, obviously, it wants to be found, it wants to be uncovered and understood for generations for us to understand our heritage. And, the reason why they're not doing that is for more nefarious reasons from my point of view. The widow, the original archaeologist, the German archaeologist who uncovered the site, Klaus Schmidt, his widow, expressed outrage at the time over her perceived destruction of certain areas when they were creating these roads through the site. And this went viral at the time, and it did have a vague effect, and they did stop certain areas of the building. Also, I wanted to point out, funding is not an issue. They have lots of money. They could spend as much time as they want intricately uncovering this site. That's not an excuse. That's not a reason why they're not uncovering it. It's just because they just don't want to for some particular reason. And even, I have a lot of criticism towards mainstream academia, but even the experts in academic forces have complained about how the fact this site is being now privately managed and they have literally no input in the site at all. If you allow me, I'm going to get on my soapbox again, because I think this really ties into a larger, more important agenda. I mean, I try not to be too conspiratorial on this channel, but it's really hard sometimes. But yeah, it's just basically this idea that they're just trying to monetize and privatize everything, make everything a tradable asset. And this is just like the next step in commodifying things, taking over of ancient architecture, taking over of natural landscapes. You could argue that people have been tradable assets since birth. There's a whole conspiracy about US birth certificates are actually traded on the stock exchange. And it all ties into a lot of conspiracy to do with, Klaus Schwab. I know he's potentially, stepped down from this position as head of that organization. But again, sometimes you could argue, maybe these people are just puppets. They're just front men. They're not necessarily the real controllers behind what's going on. But at the time of Klaus Schwab was really pushing this idea of stakeholder capitalism. And it ties into this idea of, creating natural asset classes and commodifying natural things, commodifying mountains, forests, nature in general. And of course, they'll justify it. It's like, it's a reason for them to be able to protect it. You say, we'll commodify it, we'll monetize it, and therefore it's got value, and therefore we'll protect it. But from my point of view, it's just about control and, then potentially like charging people to access nature, to access forest because, they perceive it, that they own it, they have ownership over it. You're just visiting. So from my own humble point of view, I think potentially that narrative is potentially playing out with this sacred site. And in the United Kingdom a few years ago, when the Conservative government sort of got in after, Labour, collapsed, I think it was a number of years ago, he's probably talking about over 10 years ago now, they did try something similar. They tried to privatise some of the public forests in the United Kingdom. And actually there was a big outcry at the time. They rolled back that whole agenda. But I think that whole thing is now happening on a global scale and happening in more of a sneaky way with better marketing. So people probably won't overtly realize it's happening around them. Again, it's just this obsession just creating a monetary value and creating markets in everything, like creating a chargeable resource. And then therefore, then you have the right to tax people. You have this God-given right for people to go out into the sea, to go out into the forest, to go out in nature, but they, or to access a sacred site, but they're creating a paywall around it. Same with like potentially Stonehenge. They say, oh, it's there to protect it. It's there, to preserve it for future generations, which is a good argument. But also, again, there could be a deeper reason why they're restricting it. And, you have to buy quite an expensive ticket to access these places. I always remember years ago, I had this really epic trip. We went across Africa. So overland tour, started in Kenya and worked our way down all the way to South Africa. It was a really powerful experience and I have incredibly fond memories of the whole thing. And we just flown from India and it was hot and really muggy in India. And I was just really loving the cooler weather in Kenya, I remember. We arrived in Nairobi, and then we basically had to take this very like rickety, sort of bumpy tour into the deep of Kenya, and we sort of met the Maasai. I've never seen such unadulterated nature. You could sort of look out into the landscape. There was nothing apart from, huge game animals, just like trees and grasslands. And there was no aspect of humanity there at all. No electrical pylons, no towers or chimneys in the distance. I'd never seen anything like it. And this land stretched, for miles and miles and miles and miles into various different countries. I mean, it's a whole stretch of land that was, important migration for animals. They would start in Kenya and work their way down to warmer climates, and they would literally be crossing various countries doing it. And it was just, I've never seen such like huge areas of vast land of just pure unadulterated nature. And, it's just something because, in the UK, everything's so managed and, the forests, so many of the forests have been cut down. There's just fences everywhere because everyone owns a parcel of land in this country. So walking, generally in nature can be a bit tricky because you have to sort of work your way around various fences and walk along and footpaths. And what was just amazing, that experience in Africa, you just don't get footpaths, you just don't get fences. The Maasai there, they just don't understand that concept of ownership of the land. It's just not in their vernacular, it's not in their language. Particularly in England, it can be quite a frustrating experience. You just feel quite controlled about where you can go. It's frustrating. I think, Scotland's a lot better. You do have more wilderness there. There's more freedom. There are more laws actually as well. There's, right to roam. So you do have a legal right to kind of enter certain lands, even though it might be privately owned. And I think that's important for future generations. But yeah, that African experience is really, really, really. But and I know obviously there are probably other areas, definitely in America, you get vast swathes of landscapes where there's no one there, and you get no hint of civilization and stuff. And I just find that a really powerful experience. I think Africa was the first place where I really experienced that. Anyway, I'll try and get off my big soapbox. But yeah, I think there's a general trend of commodifying, not just nature, but also these important sacred sites. And it's obviously through these proxy companies, organizations like the Douglas Group, and it then kind of connects. It's a whole octopus, isn't it, with their tentacles? Who knows how far it goes up, but it's just essentially there's a general control of these places, and obviously it looks like they're artificially stopping all excavation because they want humanity to not really understand their heritage and where they've come from. And I think there's something probably quite important buried at Göbeklitepe in terms of what it is and what it represents. And I think there are forces that just don't want people to know what's there, and that's very, very sad. So the whole thing to me, that whole story is very, very fishy. But I think that video, if you get a chance to watch it, I did really recommend it. It's really powerful because it really breaks down some of the connections, how the WEF is potentially involved in Göbekli Tepe. So there definitely is a connection and a suppression going on, which is, very, very sad. But again, it's a type of information war. I think the more people knows about it, then obviously we can sort of hopefully work against it. So that's Göbekli Tepe. I think I'd love to visit it one day, particularly just to get some hot sun because again, the weather here in the United Kingdom has been pretty crap. It's just constant, oppressive grey skies. So the idea of being hot turkey would be quite wonderful at this point. Anyway, but moving on. So again, on happier note, it was my birthday. I say happier note because having said I'm trying not to be too conspiratorial, I just realised my segment on birthdays does get a little bit conspiratorial. But a little personal history of mine that I was born on the 7th day of the 7th month, that being July. And according to my mother, I weighed 7 pounds, 7 ounces. Unfortunately, I wasn't born in 1977 because that'd be quite cool. I was born in 1980. Um, but yeah, just the sevens has always been quite a mystic number for me. And weirdly, I remember when I moved down to Brighton on the south coast, originally went there to university and then bounced around various aspects of Europe and London, lived in different places, and then returned back to Brighton. And again, I've just left recently. But there was a period of time after university, I just realized there was so many people who I knew who had exactly the same birthday as me, 7th of July. But not just that, but just that whole month of June and July, I just knew so many people with had birthdays. So it was just strange that obviously particular type of person with a particular star sign or astrological alignment, who was born in June and July, just we were all weirdly just drawn to Brighton, to that area, just due to the energies. And, Brighton being, very creative place. And I always perceive that down to the ley lines, the energy that kind of emits then obviously seems to attract a certain type of person. But yeah, there was a particular time when I was there, probably sort of mid-20s, I just realised there was just so many birthdays happening around June and July. It was crazy. And the fact that on my birthday, 7th of July, I knew, quite well, probably about 5 different people who had a birthday on 7th of July. And I just thought that was bizarre. And there was a girl I lived with actually, my final year of university. Her birthday was also on the 7th of July, and she was born in 1977. So she had all the sevens. And then we had a couple of joint birthdays actually, but she was very much girl about town. I remember we hired out this entire club. I probably think about 90% of the people there were there for her birthday, and I had about 10% there because she was so popular, because she was quite well known in the the nightclub scene of Brighton. But yeah, fun times. But yeah, just always extraordinary the amount of people I knew around that time with a birthday around June and July. I thought that could be fascinating research to look into people's particular astrological sign, and in terms of where they gravitate in the world, what type of landscapes, what types of environments, whether it be a city, a small town, or rural areas, or near the mountains, or near the seas. There must be a correlation. So, yeah. But it just got me thinking about birthdays. I mean, these celebrations so ingrained in our culture. Sometimes you just do it unconsciously without even thinking, like, where did this come from? And, it's the same with like Christmas and all these big public holidays, particularly in the West, that we celebrate. And they're so ingrained in our culture, within our families, within our DNA. And there's so much symbolism and strange rituals involved. And people just have lost the connection. I think sometimes it's like, why are we doing this? And, obviously with a birthday, there is a big reason because that's potentially, the day you were born. But I was surprised to find out that early Christians and Jews didn't actually celebrate having a birthday, particularly in the case of Christianity, because no one was more special than Jesus or God. So you would celebrate Jesus' birthday when he was born. But yeah, you would never individually celebrate your own because there was no one more important than Jesus and God. So, that was a very, very alien concept, the idea of like celebrating your own birth. It just wouldn't happen during those times. This snippet of information was very surprising to me. And I started to research a bit more. And apparently, there's a book called The Law of Birthdays, and its authors Ralph and Adeline Linton. And there's an extract from that book. And it actually goes on about how birthdays were popularized during more ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. These are perceived as being cradles of civilizations, were the first lands in which men remembered and honored their birthdays. The keeping of birthday records was important in ancient times, principally because a birth date was essential for having a casting of a horoscope. So back in Mesopotamia and Egypt, having a connection to your birthday was vital because you would have your horoscope and fortune telling. They were very much enamored by the stars and some of the symbolism that comes with the constellations and how that fits into how it influences their lives and how it influences their society. So the birth date was incredibly important to be able to organize their society, and they had a whole science behind it. So the science of the stars and, where people were born in the world and at what date they were born was incredibly important to how they constructed their society. It influenced how they built their architecture in terms of the constellations. It was vital. So obviously the whole planning of their civilization revolved around this fact. But particularly in the West, many people perceive that, birthdays were popularized by paganism. And it was also very much influenced by the Romans. The Romans apparently had a mystery religion called Mithricism. And this spread the idea of birthdays throughout the Roman Empire, throughout Europe. Originally, it started with the god Mithras, whose birthday was actually on the 25th of December, which is kind of quite wild because obviously that's the date we celebrate Christmas. And it's strange how, these Christian concepts of the baby Jesus and sort of Roman religious views have all kind of merged into one. So they've got the god Mithras has the same birthday as Jesus Christ. So we're really celebrating a hybrid concept of Christmas, and it's a mixture of Roman mythology, paganism, Christianity. Pagans would be celebrating the birth of the sun, and the Romans, they would be feasting in honor of Saturn. So you have this real mixture, hodgepodge of symbolism and customs, which we adhere to this day, really. And, from those, the birthdays of the sun or the birthday of the god Mithras, then we start to get individual birthdays that we would celebrate in our own right. So as a rule in the ancient world, people would only really celebrate the birthday of their deity. And a lot of the time it was linked to astrological movements and the idea of the birth of the sun, the winter solstice. You'd have the rebirth. It's all kind of coded in the language as well, like birthday, rebirth, and it all, linked to the movements of the sun a lot of the times. And then later on, you would start to have various monarchs, kings and queens that would rule over particular civilizations, and potentially they would perceive themselves as being called upon by a particular god and placed in that position. They had divine right to rule. So then people naturally would also celebrate not only the deity's birthday, but the birthday of the king or queen who were ruling over them, because they would be above them. They would perceive to be kind of a demigod in their own right, in a way. I'm not sure of the situation with the current king, King Charles, but definitely Queen Elizabeth, who obviously died recently. She had two birthdays because her actual birthday was in April, so they were quite cold period of time. So officially they would have another birthday in June when it was warmer, and they would have these big parades and processions in her honour. But obviously April's too cold, so essentially she'd have the luck of having two birthdays. I assume as people's collective consciousness grew, people started to worship less deities and also monarchs as well. And then just naturally start to celebrate their own path, their own birthdays, their own existence on this planet. But let's talk about the darker side of birthdays. Going to get conspiratorial again. And I think it's all encoded in the concept of language and the words that we use, particularly around our birth and birthdays. And there's a whole conspiracy and theory around the idea that we live under a thing called Admiralty law. And rather than perceive us as being divine, infinite beings when we're born, the state, the government, the powers that were perceive us as being a dead entity or an entity of commerce, kind of like a ship, like a big ship, like a big boat. And this is why we're given a thing called a birth certificate. This is the start of the process. So you're born from your mother in this beautiful process, it's the divine, perfect individual. Then you're given this birth certificate and essentially treats you like a dead entity. And the reason why it sort of ties into the idea of Admiralty law and, laws of the sea is that birth in terms of birth is like birth, like when you birth the ship, Berth. So there's a lot of dual use in the way the language occurs. And when you're born, you come down, the birth canal, through your mother. And again, canal has a very naval aspect to the language. And it doesn't stop them in the whole naval aspect when you go to court or stand in the dock. These are all naval terms. It's a strange twist and inversion in the language from the word. So when you're describing this beautiful process of having a birth and having a baby, that you're actually weirdly sort of using magic to sort of perceive yourself as being this dead entity because of the language has been co-opted in some way. And that's the strange thing about commerce, the whole idea of business, what runs the world and how we earn money. Either how the fact that business, you would set up a corporation and it's like it's like a dead being. It's, already written into the language. And again, going back to the birthing process, when you're born, you go to a hospital and you would see a doctor. So it's like docking a ship. And then you have a delivery room. So these are all very, very sanitized terms that kind of fit in with legalese of like the naval world of naval law in a way. So again, off the bat, you're really treated like a dead entity of commerce. And, when you're born, obviously you're given a birth certificate. And if you want to travel, then you're given a passport. And when you're a member of a particular country, you're given citizenship. And again, it's that idea of a ship, again, more naval terms in there. And then when you want to, go to another country on holiday or to move there, then you need a passport to cross, country lines. And again, pass and then port having that naval influence again. This whole idea of Admiralty law, what it means and how it perceives you as being this dead entity and how you're treated by the state. So, essentially when you arrive in court under legal matters, they're treating you like a dead person, not like a divine being that you are. And that's how they get away with, making you being debt or having a mortgage. And this is a whole big topic of conversations as a whole movement of people trying to get around this, and you can create a thing called a live life claim, which is a document which essentially just states that you're a live being, so you kind of operate above this whole Admiralty law. So people kind of create this documentation, and when they go to court, the court can't do anything because they can only control and influence dead entities. So these individuals with this live life claim, there's a whole theory behind it. They can get out of things like mortgages and debt because, again, they're alive. And so therefore, they're not allowed to be put in these debt situations. So there's countless stories of people not paying bills, not paying electricity bills, not paying water bills, not having to pay their mortgage back because of going through this route of creating a live life claim. It is quite complicated and very time consuming, but definitely people have done it. So there is a possibility, due to the encoded language and the use of Admiralty law and how the words have been inverted, that when we're celebrating birthdays, essentially we're going through the ritual. We're celebrating our slavery into this debt system in a way, which is quite an uncomfortable place to be in and to think about. But it's not just the act of having a birthday. The very birthing process itself could have been inverted. And there is a thing where you can consider maybe the traditional hospital visit and then having a doctor deliver a baby as being complete inversion about really what's supposed to happen. And that traditional mainstream way of having a baby just creating as much trauma, as much pain as possible for both the mother and the baby. But I know there is a real movement of people breaking out of that system. You can have births at home, you can have water births, and there are other systems, around this. I've never had a child. I don't know much about it, but I know people who have, experienced alternative birthing, and it's been a lot more positive, a lot healthier experience, both for the baby and for the mother. I mean, the sort of traditional hospital birth, you're in this bright hospital, strange surroundings, really uncomfortable to be there, like got complete strangers all around you. Back in the olden days, the mothers were probably given so many different, a huge cocktail of drugs just to kind of numb the pain as well. And then the baby comes out, they're slapping the baby. There's all these things that are going on that just causing more and more trauma. And then obviously going to be the more trauma that baby experiences, they can be more and more damaged as an adult as a result. All these early experiences can affect people for life. But you could give them a pass, you could say, well, it's just a lower level of consciousness, Western medicine. Obviously now it's getting better, have more of an understanding. But you could also view it through the lens that no, these protocols were designed for a reason to cause as much trauma as possible. And there's one aspect to this which is quite shocking, which I learned a couple of years ago, is to do with the placenta. So obviously when the baby comes out, then the placenta comes out shortly afterwards. And we're the only mammal where the placenta is removed straight away. All other mammals, when they're born, the placenta is left connected to the baby. But with humans, for some bizarre reason, it's detached quite quickly. The reason the placenta needs to be maintained with the baby is because it holds vital nutrients and minerals. And naturally, all those things should transfer into the baby, and naturally the placenta should shrivel up and dry and drop off again naturally. The fact that it's severed quite early on, you're completely disadvantaging that person and can reduce their overall IQ later on in life, but also their overall well-being as well. So you can see now why it's really bizarre that majority of all mammals, the placenta is maintained on the baby. But with humans, for some reason, this protocol has come in where it has to be disconnected really, really quickly. And again, nefariously, is that being put in position on purpose to put humanity at a particular disadvantage. Now it's going to get even weirder. You have a strange connection between placenta and cake. Now, so quite innocently, you might have a lovely, lovely birthday cake baked and you have lovely icing on top, and you would put candles on them. You would blow those candles out in celebration of your age and your birthday. Now, strangely, the Latin for cake is actually placenta. And this strange symbolism of candles is very much linked to the dead and the fact you would light candles at a funeral. So, in a way, are we being involved in some Kabbalistic ritual of celebrating the dead? I know it's a bit of a dark thought, but there is a potential for that because it is a really strange ritual. Like everything I'm talking about, take it or leave it, whether it resonates. But yeah, I just thought it was quite funny. You'll be happy to know I didn't have a cake or candles, so I didn't celebrate it in that way. But I have in the past, definitely, and maybe I will again in the future. But yeah, just definitely bears thinking about. It's really, really strange how it all kind of connects in together. Crazy information. It's wild how the last podcast was, I was talking about the Matrix and our reality and how it all fits together. And you've got this strange coding of language. It's just truly bizarre sometimes that we have these rituals that we just go into quite unconsciously. But, really what's underpinning it? What are we really celebrating? I mean, I could be completely off the mark and wrong, but yeah, it's just a bit of a Debbie Down if you think about it sometimes. This is a last minute addition, an emergency addition to the podcast. I've been recording this over Friday and over the weekend, and it was Saturday night. I was lying in bed, doom scrolling on Twitter, which I shouldn't be doing. I should be reading. But at a certain point, just before I was about to turn my phone off, my whole timeline on Twitter started to fill full of videos and images to do with Donald Trump and surviving a potential assassination. And depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on, I guess there's going to be a huge range of emotions. But I think we can all agree it was quite a momentous, powerful event for all sorts of reasons. And again, I'm not taking any particular sides, but obviously what happened was big. And so it's important to talk about it. But spoiler alert, the bullet missed. It just clipped his top of his ear. And there's just a lot of very iconic photography in videos that came out as a result of that. And I know certain individuals sort of claiming, because some of the photography is so iconic, people are claiming that it was potentially staged. It's a marketing ploy in a way, I guess. But what interests me is not the actual event itself, although it was obviously charged with so much emotion and so much going on. It was just leading up to that. There's just been a lot going on in terms of prophetic messages and remote viewing data, which basically verified this event was going to happen quite a while ago, which is what fascinates me. On the material surface in the 3D, it does feel like there was a complete lapse in terms of the Secret Service in their ability to protect this individual. So yeah, that's one aspect to it, and it's all very, very early days. But the remit of this podcast is to look in the weird and strange aspects of things, and definitely the fact that you have remote viewing data that kind of surfaced from around about 3 or 4 months ago, and also biblical prophecy that certain pastors have been talking about from their Christian point of view. It's kind of quite wild how it all verifies everything that kind of happened over the weekend. Firstly, I've probably mentioned these guys before, but they're called the Future Forecasting Group. They're a remote viewing organization. They originally purely concentrated on remote viewing cryptocurrencies, but now they've really expanded into sort of current news, metaphysics, a whole host of aspects of our reality they now concentrate on. So it's not purely cryptocurrency, but I think that's where they started initially. Anyway, they, like a lot of remote viewing groups, they tend to do regular updates in terms of the up and coming news events that are going to be seen in the forthcoming months. And they already did a very good job in forecasting large scale events in terms of the attack on Gaza and Palestine and the Israel situation. They kind of picked up that quite early on, which is really, really impressive. But in terms of the Trump scenario, the assassination attempt that occurred on Saturday, a few of their remote viewers seem to have picked up on some of the data points of that event. One of the individuals, Naeem, he seemed to pick up on a couple of different sessions that I'm aware of this potential shooting. Although in one of his sessions, actually the victim appeared to die, but then potentially that is just reading that visual of as a dead person, not necessarily, obviously, in reality, Donald Trump was on the floor, but he was very much alive, but he was basically just lying on the floor trying to get to safety. This remote viewing evidence is a powerful example of how important potentially remote viewing will be in the future. It seems to be gathering in terms of like how much it's being used, but also people really getting behind its credibility as well in giving humanity transparency about their reality and the direction we're all kind of going in. So I think it's becoming quite an important cornerstone potentially for this new world that we're hopefully building, and as we kind of leave this older paradigm. Anyways, I will stop rambling and you can take a listen for yourself to one of the sessions.
And the clip I'm going to show you was something we published on our website, and we published details of it on YouTube. This was witnessed by our subscribers and thousands of people. It is my colleague, Naeem Vendreas, doing a remote viewing session outlining a near future event, and this was published about 60 to 90 days before it happened. All right, this is Naeem's prediction.
And then, yeah, here I see a person in front of a crowd. And it feels, the mood there is kind of like congratulations, like clapping, cheering, honor, charisma. Then someone's up in a higher level, and the sense I get there is like sharpshooter or murder, assassin type feel. And it was really hard for me to do more work on this without without it being ruined by just noise and imagination. So I kind of stopped there. So that was in both my sessions. I had a assassination type data. So yeah, see what happens.
Now, this is a second session where Naeem picks up on more data to do with an assassination attempt.
Trying to avoid the logical conclusions that come with that, and this was one of those. Looking down the sight of a rifle, and the sense here was like hitman for hire, sharpshooter, like a public figure maybe gets assassinated. The sense here is like assassin. Feels politically motivated. I get the sense like history repeats itself. May even trigger like a national security type warning, planned and executed. I even get the word mid-speech, so maybe while someone's in public talking, maybe. And then I see a body laid out, dead, headline, murder. Feels like a betrayal situation. When you least expect it, politically motivated, and murder was the case.
It just goes to show the stunning correlation with some of the information that came up in those sessions. And again, I'll just reiterate the fact that there were the remote viewers that picked up on various aspects of the assassination attempt at different times as well. So that definitely happened. But that same remote viewing group have been working quite closely with an individual called Cliff High. And I think now he's probably like a retired developer, computer developer. He's very much versed in computer systems, and he's created this complex, I don't quite understand it, computer system where he's reading and scraping data off the internet. And through that, he can predict changes in human consciousness. So he's able to read when things are going to change in terms of world events, when there's going to be some kind of like high impact event, because there are telltale signs, a few months before as things start to build up from the data he gathers off the internet. So using that same computer system, his data was suggesting that actually during mid-July, something quite large was going to happen, something quite big in terms of changing people's consciousness. But it wasn't really clear what. I don't really know the huge amount of detail because I used to be a subscriber of that particular channel, the Future Forecasting Group, but I'm not at the moment. So I haven't really deep dived into it. So I've only got a cursory understanding of potentially what went on. But in terms of like a high impact event in mid-July, I was bracing myself for some sort of war situation, like a false flag or a missile, a direct attack really to kind of escalate things. But potentially, actually, again, he was, through this computer system, he was predicting this Trump assassination, and the energy and the complete change of consciousness that it's affected across the world has definitely occurred. So yeah, I think it's probably likely that that's what he was referring to. Anyway, all of this just goes to show these powerful new tools were emerging and to give humanity more transparency in taking control of their own destiny, potentially with this use of remote viewing. And again, this computer system that Cliff High has designed as well. But now we're going to go a bit biblical. There's a wild video that's been making the rounds on the Twitter sphere, and it was recorded around 4 months ago. So there's obviously this way before, the assassination that happened on Saturday, and you can verify the video for yourself because it's very obviously recorded a while ago. But it's basically based on a YouTube channel, a Christian YouTube channel, and there's a pastor on there called Brandon Briggs, and he's basically claims that God spoke to him about what was going to happen to Donald Trump in terms of this assassination attempt, and also for future events in terms of his election, everything that happens with that. But the detail of the assassination was so spot on, it's scary. So I'll let you listen to that now.
And it was being birthed, and it just kept spreading like fire all throughout America, all throughout. And I saw Trump rising up, and then I saw an attempt on his life. This bullet flew by his ear, and it came so close to his head that it busted his eardrum. And I saw he fell to his knees during this time frame, and he started worshiping the Lord. He got radically born again during this time frame. I'm talking, people say he's saved now, but he becomes really on fire for Jesus, for what I saw coming. And then I saw people interceding when I saw him winning the presidency through great. The Lord showed me it would go clear into the summer. Great persecution would come on him through the judges and through the law and all these people trying to sue him and all this stuff. But there would be a stop to it, and things would start to break free come toward the fall. And then I saw him winning the election through the Patriots coming out and voting, and then there will be a great economy crash. Yeah. I saw they had a great economy plan, a crash. Yeah. Worse than the Great Depression. And the Lord warned me about this. It would be a great dark time. But I saw paddles coming upon America's soil, like a shocking of the soil. And I saw Donald Trump praying in the office of the Oval Office. And he was weeping before the Lord with his hands on his head like this, but he was weeping. And there was ministers and people. I don't know if they were senators or Congress people or whatever. I just saw them pacing and back and forth inside of the White House. What is the White House? But it's the Oval Office. Yeah. And they were interceding all inside there, and I could feel the presence of the Lord so strong on this. And then I could see that darkness that was the heaviness upon America with the financial crisis of what I saw coming. It started to lift above the trees, and I saw the blue and the things coming back out, and the green times and the good times coming back again. But the Lord said it would be forth a time of a season of a shaking.
As you just heard for yourself, like what he said there, was just uncanny with the details that emerged on Saturday, just spot on. And it will be interesting, obviously, in the coming months to sort of see whether there's some of the future forecasts he had for what happens to Trump actually come to fruition as well. And again, this clip is like all over Twitter, all over the internet, so you can find it for yourself. But I've, personally verified the original video, and it was definitely recorded 4 months ago. So yeah, he hasn't made it up, and he's obviously kind of tapped into something. It doesn't really matter whether you're Christian or whether you're like Trump. I mean, you have to agree, like the details just so uncannily correct. It's crazy. And finally, something less politically charged, I think. Again, as I was doom scrolling when I shouldn't be, the last podcast, as I mentioned, was all to do with the Matrix film, and it was re-released, 25 years since it was originally released in cinemas. And so they did a whole podcast on the Matrix and reality itself. And there was an individual called Sophia Stewart, who I mentioned very, very briefly, and because she claimed to have written the Matrix film, its entire narrative, and also the Terminator films. What she claims is that during the 80s, she sent in a script called The Third Eye, I think it was called. But it had all of these concepts that were conveyed in the Terminator films and the Matrix films. And she claims that, basically these concepts were stolen from her, and she's never really been given any writing credit for it at all. And honestly, I didn't know whether this is true or not, but I thought it was important to include. I know there's been various court cases. Some of them have definitely not been in her favor, but there's a vagueity in one of the court cases where, her case was upheld and she won it. And, it did sort of officially say that she was the author of some of these concepts. And again, it was quite hard to verify that information as well. But I just came across this video where she's actually describing how the Terminator films and the Matrix sort of fit together, and it's pretty mind-blowing. So I'll let you listen to it now.
How did you come up with the Terminator? Take us there and the Matrix, and just to put this from pen to pad. Now, it's one thing to have the idea, but it's
very easy. It was a script in a book. The Terminator is the prequels to, or the beginning of the Matrix. Sarah Connor is actually Neo's mother. So JC, John Connor's Jesus Christ, grows up to be Neo, one and the same in the Matrix. The Matrix is in the future. The Terminator is the past. It's time travel, past, present, and future time travel. It's the second coming of the Christ, the evolutions of consciousness, man versus the machine. So the machines, the Terminator machines here, that a child is going to be born that's going to terminate them in the future when they oppress man. Because see, it's a man versus the machine. It's God's children versus man's children, which was technology.
So man versus nature.
Exactly. So the Terminator has to time travel to the past because they know it's Sarah Connor, and they have to kill her, terminate her, so she won't have the baby. And Kyle Reese, he comes from the future to protect her, and he inadvertently gets her pregnant. And he has to go back to the future. And so it's the Immaculate Conception, because now she's pregnant and she fell in love with a man, but did it really happen? Did he exist? And then this child, when you see the three Terminators, the boy, and then the man child, subconsciously, he doesn't know why the Terminator is trying to kill him until he's hidden out in the city, in the Matrix, the future. When he reaches 30 years of age, the rebellion, the Reloaded, revolution starts. And the rebels come and they find him because they've been watching him all along. That's what the Guardians and the Sentinels are all about. And so they wake him up to his purpose. They take him to Morpheus to train him to fight the machines. They take him to the Oracle because of the prophecy. So this is the whole epic story. It's an epic.
It's just crazy how both of those narratives really fit together, and it just creates this pretty epic kind of arc, story, like hero's journey. And it's actually made me take her claims a little bit more seriously. It just feels like this really big biblical plot. The fact that they are connected, the two stories. And let's just not hope that this film, that narrative she created or that was conveyed in both Terminator and Matrix doesn't end up echoing humanity's own timeline, because that would be pretty depressing. I don't want our reality to be taken over by machines and subjugate into some kind of Matrix like control system. That's not if we're already in one. That's another whole situation. Let's just hope humanity's very carefully able to navigate these AI waters, and for it to aid us on our journey and not to subjugate us and to take over and to make us atrophy in certain ways, and to sort of maintain our humanity, and definitely not to start getting involved in transhumanism. I feel quite passionate about that. But yeah, I thought it was really poignant to include that clip. So that just about concludes this podcast. It's been a crazy one, a wild ride. A lot has happened, even as I've been recording it. These journal entries tend to bounce all over the shop, but that's the whole point of it. It's a real patchwork of craziness, I guess. We're definitely living in incredibly interesting times, and it's keeping us on our toes. But even from my own perspective, maybe you're feeling it as well. Sometimes it can feel very, very overwhelming, like what is actually going on. And admittedly, there's been points during these last few weeks I felt pretty low at points, particularly with like UK elections. I'm sort of trying to take the path of now as being sort of apolitical, because I just feel a lot of the time this idea of choice, political choice, is a little bit of an illusion. It doesn't really matter who kind of comes in power. They always end up acting the same for various reasons. So yeah, I just think maybe as a species, humanity's given their power away too much. And I think we need to sort of take control of our own reality, our own destiny. I don't have any solutions as yet how that will form in terms of politics. But yeah, that's just the way I feel. So there's definitely been points these last few weeks where I'm just like, oh my God, can't take any more. But one thought I did have was to just get rid of political parties, so everyone has to stand independently. And then so you don't have a whole kind of tribalism situation that we have now in Western countries, and maybe people then who are elected to particular offices for a particular area in their country will then actually work for local people rather than the party and corporate interests. As usual, I could be completely off the mark and wrong, and there's an amazing brand spanking new system round the corner, and it's going to solve all our problems, and life is going to be sweet. But yeah, I think there is a tendency, I mean, I'm guilty as anyone, to go on the internet, and some of the things you see, it just gets amplified, doesn't it? And it's important to go outside. I've sort of really got back into my windsurfing and water sports recently, and just, when I've been talking to people connected to that. And you just don't mention anything to do with like politics or anything. It's just sort of general life. And I sort of forget, most people just want to get by. They just want to have fun. They want to have fun with their families and go on holiday and stuff. And I think that's the mindset most people are in. So yeah, I think it's important to remind ourselves of that, just to go out, interact with people, and do fun things, which is what I'm trying to do. So thank you for joining me on this podcast, this audio release, this Journal 5. Please do share this podcast, like it. You can subscribe on Rumble, on BitChute, on YouTube and Odyssey. You can catch the podcast there, and also the up and coming vlogging videos I've been doing as well. They'll be up soon. Orford Ness, that's coming. And yeah, you can catch this podcast on all podcast major platforms in the world, ever in the universe. And I've been Reconsider Simon. It's been amazing being with you, and I will catch you at the next one. Take care. Goodbye.